We rejoin our friend and semi-hero Roger Wilco as he rockets back toward his home planet Xenon, which he hasn't seen since Space Quest II. Having successfully rescued those two ingrates from Andromeda, he decides a pit stop on Megmetheus is in order. During the descent to this cosmic canteen, he is unaware of the interest that has been generated regarding his fate.
We have confirmation of his position, Master.
Off to Megmetheus with you, then. It is time for Wilco to meet the fate which I have crafted for him.
As our story begins, we find the aluminum mallard parked outside a seedy spaceport bar. We join Roger as he relates one of his greatly exaggerated tales of adventure. The aliens are only too happy to listen, as long as Roger is buying.
See, there was this deadly root monster, a ferocious swamp creature, and a Labion terror beast to contend with. Then I had to outsmart another of Vohal's gorillas and steal the shuttle so I could penetrate the asteroid fortress and pull the plug on that corpulent creep once and for all. Yeah, all in a day's work for a guy like me. Anyway, I aborted the launch and jetted out of there in an escape pod.
Are you Roger Wilco?
Yeah.
Please come with me.
Hello, Roger Wilco. Surprised to see an old friend? You have no idea how special this moment is for me. This is no chance encounter, I can assure you. I have this one loose end to tie up before I begin my reign as the supreme being of all that exists. I do not like to lose. You are a blemish on what would otherwise be a perfect record of domination, terror, and invincibility. Besides, I'm still a bit miffed about that asteroid deal in Space Quest 2. Anyway, to relieve the pain of my humiliation and prevent you from being a pain in my future, you must die. It's been nice seeing you one last time. Then, do the dirty deed.
You go left and split them up. Mr. Wilco, follow me and do exactly as I say. Let's move!
Hey, I want to know what the...
Listen, I can't explain it all to you now. They've got a beat on our coordinates. We've got to move fast. We gotta do this fast. Shield your eyes! Jump into the time rip! Do it now! You've got to! If I take the time to explain, we're both parking lot pizza. You'll understand soon.
Now where am I? Along with the changes induced by an arm. What's happened? Who was... You take the small, frayed, useless-looking length of rope. That was without a doubt one of the finest examples of bunny snatching I've ever seen. The stress placed on the rope during the bunny snatching was too much. You cast the useless fibers aside. A quick inspection reveals nothing. After taking a quick look around to reassure yourself that the place is as dead as it looks, you snitch the Pocket Pal laptop. Keep your hands to yourself.